Jake Reynolds had always dreamed of traveling the world, and London was his first big stop. At 24, with his friends by his side, he felt like he was on top of the world. The excitement of being in a new city, exploring places he had only seen in movies, filled him with an energy he couldn't quite control. They spent the day sightseeing, taking pictures at iconic landmarks like the Tower of London and the London Eye. But as the evening came, the city's buzzing nightlife seemed to offer even more adventure than they had imagined. After dinner, the group wandered around the heart of London, talking and laughing as they passed through crowded streets. Jake wasn't one to shy away from excitement, and he loved being the center of attention. His friends were more cautious, often reminding him to take it easy, but Jake thrived on the thrill of doing things others might consider risky. It was during one of these late-night strolls when they found themselves standing in front of Buckingham Palace. Jake had heard stories about the royal guards, those unmovable soldiers who stood at attention, never reacting, no matter what the world threw at them. Tourists flocked to them, trying to get a reaction, but the guards remained stoic and serious. It was a challenge, an unspoken game, and for Jake, this was the perfect opportunity for a little fun. Feeling the rush of his day's adventures, Jake laughed and pulled something from his bag, a firecracker he had picked up earlier. It wasn't anything huge, just a small one, but in his drunken state, he thought it would be a funny way to mess with the guards. He wanted to see if they would flinch, if they would even notice. Maybe he'd get a laugh from his friends and the nearby tourists. Maybe he could make the moment memorable. Without thinking, Jake lit the firecracker and threw it near one of the royal guards, who stood in perfect silence. As the fuse burned down, the small firecracker made a loud pop, followed by a sudden, explosive bang. The noise rang out through the night, echoing against the palace walls. In that moment, everything seemed to freeze. The guard didn't flinch. His posture didn't change at all. But the crowd nearby gasped in shock, and chaos spread quickly. A few bystanders screamed and rushed away. People scrambled for cover, unsure of what was happening. The air turned tense, and in the distance, sirens could already be heard. Jake, still chuckling to himself, didn't immediately realize the seriousness of what he had just done. He thought it was just a harmless prank. He never imagined it would cause such a stir. He felt like the king of the world for a moment, until the first officer arrived on the scene. The seriousness in the officer's eyes quickly wiped the grin off Jake's face. He hadn't seen it coming. The officer didn't ask questions or give warnings. Within moments, more officers arrived, their presence growing as the seconds passed. Jake tried to laugh it off, but the situation was quickly turning out to be more than he had bargained for. The reality of his mistake started to hit him as he was escorted toward the police van. His friends, who had been by his side just moments before, were nowhere to be found. They had run off in panic, leaving Jake alone to face the consequences of his impulsive act. The moment that had started as a prank now felt like the beginning of a nightmare. What he had thought was a small joke had spiraled into something much bigger, and Jake had no idea how much trouble he was in. The loud bang of the firecracker echoed through the night, and for a brief moment, Jake felt an adrenaline rush. He expected people to laugh, or at the very least, be surprised by the unexpected noise. But the situation quickly changed. As soon as the firecracker went off, the entire atmosphere around him shifted. The once lively street, filled with tourists and Londoners alike, suddenly became tense and chaotic. The royal guard remained perfectly still, not reacting to the explosion in the least. But the crowd around him wasn't as calm. People screamed, some in fear, others in confusion. Some ran, while others looked around in panic, unsure of what was happening. A few people even ducked, instinctively seeking cover as if they had just witnessed an act of violence. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the chaos unfold. What had started as a silly prank now felt very different. As he looked around, trying to take in what was happening, he noticed the first signs of trouble. A police car pulling up in the distance, its sirens cutting through the night air. It was like a scene out of a movie. But this wasn't a film. It was real life, and Jake was at the center of it. He tried to laugh, hoping the situation would blow over. Surely the police would see that it was just a harmless prank, right? But as the seconds ticked by, his confidence started to wane. The officer who approached him wasn't laughing, and neither were the other officers who were now surrounding him. There was no playful banter. No, it's okay. Just don't do it again. Instead, they were all serious, their faces hard as they closed in on him. Jake's mind raced. He had only been trying to create a funny moment to share with his friends, not start a scene. But now, standing in the middle of the chaos he had caused, he realized that this wasn't going to be as simple as he thought. The sound of footsteps on the pavement grew louder as more officers arrived. One of them quickly grabbed him by the arm and started guiding him toward a waiting police van. Jake opened his mouth, about to protest, but the look on the officer's face told him it was too late for excuses. "Please, I didn't mean any harm," Jake said, trying to keep his voice calm. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but he could feel his stomach sinking with each passing second. The officer didn't respond, just continued walking as they reached the van. Inside, the atmosphere felt colder than it had in the streets. The reality of his situation was beginning to sink in. Jake had always considered himself a fun-loving guy, someone who liked to push the limits and make people laugh. But now he was beginning to see the consequences of his reckless behavior. He could only imagine how much trouble he was in. As the van door closed behind him, Jake felt an overwhelming sense of regret. The lights from the street lamps outside flickered through the small window, casting shadows on his face. His mind began to race through the possibilities. Would he be arrested? Would he be sent back home? Would he ever be able to come back to London again? The seriousness of the situation was now undeniable, and there was no going back. The more Jake thought about it, the more he realized just how deeply he had misjudged the situation. What he had thought was a harmless joke was now something much more dangerous. And in just a few minutes, everything had changed. Jake sat in the back of the police van, feeling the cold, hard seat beneath him. The van bounced along the London streets, the hum of the engine the only sound filling the air. His mind was in a daze, replaying the events over and over. How had things escalated so quickly? It felt like just moments ago he was laughing with his friends and having a good time. Now he was being taken to a police station in handcuffs. He glanced out the small window, but all he could see were the blurry lights of the city passing by. The realization was starting to set in. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. The firecracker, which he had thought would be a harmless prank, had caused a commotion so big that it had caught the attention of law enforcement immediately. What had seemed like a funny idea now felt like the worst mistake of his life. When the van finally pulled up to the station, Jake was guided out by the officers, the cold night air hitting him like a slap to the face. He could feel the eyes of the people around him, watching the scene unfold. It didn't help that the viral video of his prank had already spread across social media. The footage of him throwing the firecracker near the Royal Guard was everywhere, on the news, Twitter, and even in memes. Jake's name was being shared far and wide, and it wasn't for anything good. The officers led him inside the station, and Jake could feel the tension building as they walked through the dark hallways. His head spun with thoughts of what would happen next. He had no idea what the consequences would be for his actions, but he was sure they wouldn't be pleasant. As they reached the interrogation room, Jake's nerves kicked into high gear. He was placed in a chair, and for a moment, he sat there, completely silent. The reality of the situation was much worse than he had imagined. There was no going back now, no way to undo what he had done. He wanted to tell the officers it was just a prank, that he never meant any harm, but the seriousness on their faces made it clear that this was no laughing matter. The room felt small and stuffy as one of the officers sat across from him, folding his arms. "What were you thinking?" the officer asked, his tone firm but not unkind. Jake's mind went blank for a moment. What could he say? How could he explain that he was just trying to have fun? I didn't mean to cause any trouble, Jake stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. It was just supposed to be a joke. I thought it'd be funny. The officer didn't respond right away, instead giving Jake a look that seemed to say, "You don't get it, do you?" There was a long pause, and Jake could feel the weight of the officer's stare. He felt like a child who had been caught doing something wrong, and the consequences were starting to feel very real. "Do you realize how dangerous that could have been?" The officer finally said, his voice steady, but with a hint of concern. "You don't just throw firecrackers near people, especially not near places like Buckingham Palace. You could have hurt someone or caused a bigger disaster." Jake nodded, the gravity of the situation slowly sinking in. What had seemed like a harmless joke was, in reality, a reckless act that could have gone horribly wrong. He could feel the regret deep in his chest, but it was too late to take it back. His friends had already run off, too scared to stick around and deal with the mess he had made. Now, Jake was on his own. The officer sighed, tapping his fingers on the table. "We'll have to see what happens next. But know this, you're in serious trouble." The words hit Jake hard. He had known that what he did wasn't a great idea, but he had never imagined it would lead to this. As the officer stood up and left the room, Jake sat there in the cold silence, wondering what his future would hold. He had always prided himself on being the life of the party, but now he couldn't help but feel like he had destroyed his life in just a few reckless minutes. By the time Jake had settled into the holding cell at the police station, the weight of his situation felt heavier than ever. The hustle and bustle of the officers around him seemed to blur into the background as he tried to process what had just happened. His hands were still shaking slightly from the adrenaline, and his heart was pounding in his chest. He had always known that one small mistake could come back to haunt him, but never in his wildest dreams did he imagine it would be like this. His mind raced through the chain of events, the firecracker, the explosion, the chaos that followed. And now, here he was, alone in a small, cold cell. There were no comforting sounds of laughter or the familiar faces of his friends. In fact, the only thing he could hear was the sound of his own breathing and the occasional footsteps of officers walking by. His friends had disappeared the moment the police arrived. He had hoped they might help him out of this mess, but when things got serious, they bailed. The more Jake thought about it, the more he realized that he was on his own. His phone, still locked away in the police station's evidence box, seemed like a distant memory. He had no way to contact anyone, not even his family. He knew they would be furious with him when they found out. His heart sank as he thought about how disappointed his parents would be. He had always been the wild one, the one who took risks, but he never imagined those risks would lead to something this big. As he sat there, trapped inside his thoughts, his mind drifted to the social media posts he had seen earlier. His stunt was all over the internet. The video of him throwing the firecracker had been shared thousands of times. On Twitter, people were calling him all sorts of things. The foolish tourist, firecracker guy. And worse, the post with the video had already gone viral, and the comments were flooding in faster than he could even check. His name was everywhere. Jake Reynolds had gone from an unknown tourist to a meme, a cautionary tale shared among people who were too scared to even think about doing something as reckless as he had. He had seen people on social media making jokes about what he did. Some people found it funny, sure, but the majority of people saw him as a problem. The news outlets in both the UK and the US were already reporting on the incident, painting him as a careless tourist who didn't understand the gravity of his actions. In a strange way, Jake had become famous, but not in the way anyone dreams of. The more he thought about it, the more his stomach twisted in knots. He wasn't just facing possible jail time or fines. He was facing the destruction of his reputation. What if this became the one thing everyone remembered him for? His job back home. It would never be the same. His boss would probably see the news and fire him immediately. He didn't even want to think about what his friends, or worse, his family, would say. Suddenly, he realized how completely out of control everything had become. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a complete disaster. He thought about how, just a few hours ago, he had been walking around, enjoying the night, laughing with his friends. He had no idea that one decision, one moment of stupidity, would lead to this moment in the cell. Everything had changed so quickly, and now there was no way to go back. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a door opening. A police officer appeared, looking at him through the bars of the cell. Jake knew that this was just the beginning. His life was about to take a turn, and there was no telling where it would end up. The officer didn't say anything right away, but Jake could feel the weight of what was coming. The whole world was watching now, and all he had to do was wait to find out just how big the consequences would be. The hours dragged on in the holding cell, each minute feeling longer than the last. Jake couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of dread that had settled deep inside him. The reality of what had happened was slowly sinking in, and there was no escaping it. His thoughts were like a whirlwind. Everything felt jumbled, and he had no idea what would happen next. He tried to keep his mind occupied, but it was hard. The constant ticking of the clock on the wall only made things worse. Every few minutes, a police officer would walk past his cell, giving him a glance, but no one spoke to him. He had no idea how long he would be stuck in this cold, lonely room. Time seemed to move at a crawl. Jake had never felt more alone in his life. His phone had been taken, and there was no way to contact anyone. The one thing that made him feel even worse was knowing how many people were probably talking about him right now. He could almost hear the comments and jokes on social media, mocking him, laughing at his mistake. It had only been a few hours, but the video of him throwing the firecracker had already been shared and reposted by thousands of people. It was everywhere, on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. People were calling him names like the foolish tourist and the firecracker idiot. It was clear that this wasn't going to blow over anytime soon. Jake wondered if his friends even cared about him at this point. They had run off the second the police arrived. They hadn't even stayed to help him, or at least offer him support. Were they still laughing about it? Did they even realize the seriousness of the situation? Jake had always been the one to push things to the limit, the one who made jokes and took risks. But now he could see that maybe he had taken things too far this time. And then there was his family. The thought of calling them made his stomach tighten. How could he explain to them what had happened? His parents had always warned him about the consequences of reckless behavior, but he never thought it would come to this. How could he possibly face them after this? They would be so disappointed in him. He could already hear the disappointment in their voices. As the hours ticked by, the reality of his situation started to become clearer. This wasn't just a minor mistake. The police weren't going to let him go with a slap on the wrist. Jake had made a serious error in judgment, and now he would have to pay the price. The more he thought about it, the more the weight of the consequences sank in. His life was changing in ways he couldn't have imagined, and it was all because of one impulsive decision. Finally, a door opened, and a police officer appeared. Jake sat up, his heart racing. He had no idea what was about to happen, but he could feel the tension in the air. The officer looked at him, his face unreadable. "You're going to be questioned," the officer said, his voice cold. "Prepare yourself." Jake's stomach dropped. He had been expecting this, but the reality of it was still terrifying. He had no idea what the outcome would be. What if they decided to charge him with something serious? What if this mistake ruined his life forever? As the officer led him out of the cell and down the hallway, Jake's mind raced. His future was uncertain, and he had no idea what the next few hours would bring. The one thing he did know was that his life was never going to be the same. Jake was led into a small, stark room where the air felt thick with tension. The door clicked shut behind him, and the sound echoed in the quiet space. The room was simple, with a small metal table in the center and two chairs facing each other. On one side of the table sat an officer, his face serious, his uniform crisp and professional. Jake felt the weight of the officer's gaze, and for a moment, he wasn't sure how to react. The walls around him seemed to close in, and every sound felt amplified in his ears. "Sit down," the officer said calmly, motioning to the chair across from him. Jake hesitated for a moment before doing as he was told, his mind racing with uncertainty. He had no idea what the next few minutes would bring, but he could feel the nerves bubbling inside him. The officer didn't say anything else, just stared at him for a few seconds, as if assessing him. Jake cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. "Look, I just want to explain. It was just a joke, okay? I didn't mean to cause any harm. I'm not that kind of person," he said, his words coming out faster than he intended. The officer didn't interrupt him but continued to stare, his expression unreadable. Jake felt his heart thudding in his chest. The officer finally spoke, his tone measured but firm. "You're not just in trouble for causing a disturbance, Mr. Reynolds. Throwing that firecracker near a royal guard wasn't just a prank. Do you realize how dangerous that could have been?" Jake opened his mouth to protest, but the officer held up a hand to stop him. "It could have caused panic," the officer continued, his voice steady. "People could have been injured. There's more at stake here than you realize. You've caused a public disturbance, and now there are serious consequences." Jake felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had known that what he did wasn't the best idea, but hearing the officer say it out loud made it all the more real. He had never intended for anyone to get hurt. He wasn't a bad person. He just wanted to have some fun, to be a little reckless. But he now understood that in a city like London, especially near such a high-profile place like Buckingham Palace, any small mistake could spiral out of control. "I didn't think about it like that," Jake admitted quietly, feeling the weight of his words. "I thought it would be funny. I didn't think it would get this far." The officer nodded slightly, as if acknowledging Jake's realization. "That's the problem with acts like these," he said. "They may seem harmless at first, but they can have a much bigger impact. You could have put people's safety at risk." Jake's mind swirled with thoughts of what the officer was saying. He hadn't realized just how serious the situation was. He'd been so caught up in the moment, in the fun of trying to get a reaction from the guards and impressing his friends, that he hadn't considered the consequences. Now, sitting in front of this officer, he realized how foolish he had been. "Do you understand what you've done?" the officer asked, leaning slightly forward in his chair. Jake took a deep breath, his throat tight. "Yes, I understand now." The officer sat back, his expression softening slightly, but not by much. "You're not a criminal, Mr. Reynolds, but you've made a very poor decision. And that decision has consequences." Jake nodded, his mind reeling. He had thought it would be a harmless joke, but now he could see how much damage even a small prank could cause. He wasn't a bad person, but he had certainly made a huge mistake. As the officer stood up, signaling that the questioning was over for now, Jake's heart began to race again. What would happen next? What would the consequences be? Jake had no way of knowing, but he knew one thing for sure. His life would never be the same. After what felt like an eternity, Jake was finally led out of the interrogation room. His legs felt unsteady beneath him, and his mind was still spinning from everything that had been said. The officer had left him with a sense of uncertainty hanging in the air. He wasn't sure if he was about to be charged with something serious, or if the situation would somehow resolve itself. Either way, the weight of the consequences had already sunk in. As he walked through the police station, he could feel the eyes of the officers on him. He had become the center of attention, not for anything good, but because of a reckless mistake that had spiraled out of control. Every step he took felt like a reminder of how badly he had messed up. The sound of footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway, and Jake couldn't help but wonder how long it would be before he heard from his lawyer or the authorities about what would happen next. He was placed in a small waiting area, where he was told to sit and wait for further instructions. The room was almost empty, with just a few chairs and a table. He could hear the occasional phone ringing or people talking in the background, but it all felt distant. Jake didn't want to think about what might happen next, but it was impossible to ignore the reality of the situation. He was stuck in a nightmare that had started as a silly prank, but had turned into something much more serious. The longer he sat there, the more Jake realized how far-reaching the consequences of his actions might be. He had never considered how an innocent-looking firecracker could lead to such a mess. His thoughts wandered to the news coverage. He had seen the viral videos online, heard the jokes, and read the comments. His face was plastered all over the internet, and it wasn't for anything positive. The more he thought about it, the more it sunk in. He wasn't just some tourist making a funny mistake. He had become a symbol of carelessness, and people weren't letting him forget it. The news outlets were already calling it a dangerous stunt and referring to him as the Firecracker Fool. It felt like every social media platform was buzzing with his name. And to make matters worse, the video of him throwing the firecracker had been viewed millions of times, with thousands of people weighing in on the incident. Some were sympathetic, saying it was just a stupid mistake. Others were not so kind, calling him selfish and irresponsible. He could already hear the laughter of people at his expense. He never thought something so small would blow up like this, but now he was paying the price. Jake tried to push those thoughts aside, but they kept creeping back in. His parents would be so angry. His job. He could lose it for sure. He had worked so hard to build his reputation, and now one poor decision could undo it all. The uncertainty of what lay ahead gnawed at him. He wasn't sure what the police would do, or if he'd be facing legal trouble. Would he get a fine, a criminal record, or would they let him off with a warning? The unknown was eating away at him. As the minutes dragged on, the door to the waiting room finally opened. A police officer stepped in, holding a clipboard. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He knew this moment had come. He was about to find out what would happen next. The officer's expression was unreadable as he walked over and sat across from Jake. "Mr. Reynolds," the officer began, "you've caused a great deal of trouble tonight. But after reviewing the situation, we have some options moving forward." Jake leaned forward, his pulse quickening. He couldn't stop himself from hanging on every word the officer said. Would he be sent home with a fine? Or would this mistake follow him for the rest of his life? The officer paused for a moment, making Jake wait in silence. Finally, he spoke again. "We're going to recommend that you pay a fine and attend community service. This was an act of foolishness, but we believe it can be used as a lesson." Jake's mind raced with relief, but he couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility still hanging over him. Community service was better than jail time, but it didn't erase the fact that his reputation was forever tarnished. Still, it was better than the worst-case scenario, and for now, that was something he could hold on to. Jake sat there, staring at the officer as the words slowly settled in his mind. Community service. A fine. His heart had stopped racing, but the weight of the situation hadn't lifted. He was relieved, yes, but the reality of the last few days still hung over him. The last few hours had felt like a blur, but now that the decision had been made, there was no going back. He could still feel the eyes of the officers on him as he sat there in that cold, sterile room. His phone had been returned to him, but the screen seemed distant, almost like it didn't belong to him anymore. He had no idea what to expect when he checked his social media, but he knew one thing. Things would never be the same. The world he once knew, where he could make mistakes without anyone knowing about them, was gone. His fingers trembled slightly as he scrolled through his notifications. There were messages from friends, people he hadn't heard from in years, and more surprisingly, messages from strangers. People were offering their support, telling him they understood that it had been a foolish mistake. Others, however, were still laughing at him, calling him a fool. He felt the sting of their words, even if he knew they didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But it was hard to shake off the feeling of humiliation that had come with being ridiculed. Despite everything, there was a strange sense of relief. The officer had explained that there would be no criminal charges, which meant he wouldn't have a criminal record. At least not for this incident. The fine was a harsh reminder of the mistake he had made, but it wasn't the end of the world. Community service would be a long and humbling experience, but it could be a way for him to make up for his actions. It wouldn't erase the video, the comments, or the judgment that had come with it, but it was a chance to show that he could learn from his mistake. As the officer handed him the paperwork detailing the fine and community service requirements, Jake felt a strange mix of emotions. He had thought that the punishment would be worse. Jail time, perhaps, or a criminal record would follow him for the rest of his life. But now, as he read the instructions, he realized that this was just a small chapter in a much larger story. It wasn't the end. It was just a setback. He would have to work hard to rebuild his reputation, but it was possible. Jake left the police station with a quiet sense of determination. The streets of London felt different now, somehow distant, as though the world had shifted around him. He still couldn't believe how quickly everything had spiraled out of control, but he had learned something important through it all. Recklessness, even in the name of fun, could have serious consequences, and while he couldn't change what had happened, he could control how he moved forward. He texted his family, apologizing for his actions and explaining the situation as best as he could. The response wasn't immediate, but when it came, it was more understanding than he had expected. His parents were disappointed, yes, but they were relieved that he was okay and that the situation wasn't worse. The support was small, but it felt like a lifeline in that moment. As Jake walked back to his hotel, he thought about what was next. He had a lot to work on, a lot to prove, but at least he wasn't facing something that would ruin his life. It would take time, but with hard work and responsibility, he could move past this. He wasn't proud of his mistake, but he was determined to learn from it and make things right. In the end, that's all anyone could really ask for. And so, as he looked at the bustling streets of London, Jake made a silent promise to himself. He would never make a foolish mistake like this again. He had learned his lesson, and he was ready to move forward, wiser, more cautious, and with a newfound respect for the consequences of his actions.